The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guard Thompson adjusted his red tunic one final time. At 28 years old, he had been standing at these gates for over 6 years, and the routine had become as natural as breathing. His black boots gleamed like mirrors, his tall bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his rifle rested against his shoulder with military precision. Thompson knew that within the next hour, hundreds of tourists would gather around him. They would take photos, make jokes, and try everything they could think of to make him react. Some would wave frantically in front of his face. Others would tell silly jokes or make funny faces. Children would sometimes even try to tickle him. But Thompson would remain still as a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face showing no emotion whatsoever. This was the way of the Queen's Guard. For over 300 years, these soldiers had stood watch over the royal palaces, maintaining a tradition that demanded absolute discipline. They were not just guards. They were living symbols of British heritage and unwavering duty. The training to become a Queen's Guard was unlike anything most people could imagine. Thompson remembered his first weeks at the training facility like they were yesterday, even though it had been years ago. The instructors were tough, demanding perfection in every movement, every stance, every breath. "You are not individuals anymore," his drill sergeant had barked on that first day. "You are the embodiment of centuries of tradition. When you put on that uniform, you represent every guard who has stood before you and every guard who will stand after you." The physical demands were brutal. Guards had to learn to stand completely motionless for 2 hours at a time in all kinds of weather. Rain, snow, blazing summer heat, or freezing winter winds. Nothing could make them move from their position. They practiced until their legs could handle the strain without shaking, until their backs could remain straight without aching, until their faces could show no expression no matter what happened around them. But the mental training was even harder. They learned to ignore distractions that would make any normal person react. Instructors would shout in their faces, tell them shocking news, or create loud noises right next to their ears. The guards had to remain focused, keeping their minds on their duty while blocking out everything else. Thompson had failed this test many times during training. Once, an instructor told him his grandmother had called with an emergency. His heart had started racing and worry had shown on his face before he remembered it was just a test. Another time, someone had set off a firecracker near his feet, and he had flinched slightly. Each failure meant starting over, doing extra drills and facing disappointment from his instructors. "The tourists will try everything," his training officer had explained. "They will test your resolve in ways you cannot imagine. Some will be respectful, but others will see you as entertainment. They forget that you are a real person with real feelings. Your job is to remind them, through your dignity and discipline, that some things in this world still deserve respect." The psychological preparation was just as important as the physical training. Guards learned meditation techniques to help them stay calm. They practiced focusing on a single thought or image to keep their minds occupied during long periods of standing still. Thompson often thought about his hometown during his shifts, remembering walks through the countryside with his father, or the smell of his mother's cooking on Sunday afternoons. They also learned about the history they were protecting. Thompson could recite facts about every monarch who had lived in Buckingham Palace. He knew about the architecture, the artwork, and the traditions that made this place special. Understanding the importance of what he was guarding made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. The uniform itself was a crucial part of the transformation. The heavy red tunic, made of thick wool, weighed several pounds and could become unbearably hot in summer. The tall bearskin hat, standing 18 inches high, was made from real bear fur and weighed over a pound. It affected balance and made turning the head difficult. The tight collar and formal cut of the uniform restricted movement, making every gesture deliberate and measured. When Thompson first put on the complete uniform, he had felt like a different person. The weight of the clothing, the restriction of movement, and the formal appearance all combined to create a sense of separation from his civilian self. He was no longer just a regular young man from Yorkshire. He was a Queen's Guard, part of something much larger than himself. The rules were strict and non-negotiable. Guards could not speak to tourists under any circumstances. They could not smile, laugh, or show any facial expression. They could not move from their position except during the official changing of the guard ceremony. They could not acknowledge anything happening around them, whether it was a street performer, a marriage proposal, or even a minor accident. But they were not helpless. If someone became too aggressive or posed a real threat, guards were trained to handle the situation. They could shout warnings, march toward troublemakers, or even use their rifles if absolutely necessary. These incidents were rare, but when they happened, tourists quickly learned that beneath the ceremonial exterior were real soldiers with real training. The daily routine was carefully structured. Guards would arrive early to prepare their uniforms and equipment. Everything had to be perfect. Not a single button out of place, not a speck of dust on their boots, not a wrinkle in their clothing. They would inspect each other, making sure every detail met the exacting standards expected of them. During their shifts, guards developed their own mental strategies for coping with the long periods of stillness. Some would count backwards from large numbers. Others would plan elaborate meals in their minds, thinking through every ingredient and cooking step. Thompson often composed letters to his family in his head, crafting detailed descriptions of things he wanted to tell them. The tourist reactions varied greatly. Many were respectful, taking photos from a distance and speaking in hushed tones about the tradition they were witnessing. These visitors seemed to understand that they were seeing something special, a living piece of history that connected the present to centuries of the past. But others treated the guards like theme park attractions. They would pose for silly photos, make loud jokes, or try increasingly elaborate schemes to get a reaction. Thompson had seen people do ridiculous dances, tell outrageous stories, or even bring unusual props, all in hopes of making him break character. Children were often the most challenging. Their innocence and curiosity could be touching, but also distracting. They would ask their parents why the guard would not talk to them, or wonder if he was real. Sometimes they would try to offer him gifts or drawings, not understanding why he could not respond. Through it all, Thompson and his fellow guards maintained their discipline. They understood that their role was bigger than just standing still. They were preserving something important, maintaining a connection to history that helped people remember that some traditions deserved respect and protection in an increasingly casual world. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when everything changed for Thompson. The weather was perfect, warm sunshine with a gentle breeze that made his heavy uniform more bearable than usual. He had taken his position at exactly 9 o'clock, just as he had done hundreds of times before. The tourists were already beginning to gather, cameras ready, excited chatter filling the air around the palace gates. Thompson focused his mind on the countryside near his childhood home. He could almost smell the fresh grass and hear the sheep calling to each other across the fields. This mental escape had become his favorite way to pass time during long shifts. He let his mind wander through familiar paths, remembering summer days when he had helped his father repair stone walls and tend to their small garden. Around 10:30, he noticed a small commotion near his left side. A little girl was tugging on her grandmother's hand, pulling her toward the gate where Thompson stood. The child looked to be about 6 years old, with curly brown hair and a bright yellow dress that seemed to capture the morning sunlight. Unlike most children who approached his post, this little girl was not laughing or trying to get his attention. Instead, she walked quietly, almost solemnly, carrying something in her small hands. Her grandmother followed patiently, occasionally bending down to whisper something in the child's ear. The girl stopped about 3 feet away from Thompson's position. She stood there for a moment, looking up at him with wide, serious eyes. Then, very carefully, she knelt down and placed something on the ground near his feet. It was a piece of paper folded in half, with colorful crayon marks visible on the outside. Thompson could see it clearly without moving his eyes. The drawing showed a figure in a red uniform with a tall black hat, clearly meant to be a royal guard. But this guard was different from the real thing. The crayon figure had a big, cheerful smile drawn across his face, and stick figure arms that seemed to be waving. Above the drawing, in the careful handwriting of a child who was just learning to write, were the words, "Thank you for keeping everyone safe." The little girl stood up and looked at Thompson again. She was not trying to make him smile or laugh like other children did. Instead, there was something almost respectful in her gaze, as if she understood that he had an important job to do. Her grandmother placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder and spoke softly, but loud enough for Thompson to hear. "Tell him about Daddy, sweetheart." The little girl nodded and stepped a tiny bit closer. "My daddy is a soldier too," she said in a small, clear voice. "He's far away right now, keeping other people safe just like you do." Grandma says that's why soldiers are special, because they protect everyone, even people they don't know. Thompson felt something unexpected happen inside his chest. It was like a warm feeling spreading through his body, starting from his heart and moving outward. In all his years of standing guard, no one had ever acknowledged what he did as protection. Most people saw the ceremony, the tradition, the spectacle, but this child saw past all of that to the real purpose underneath. The grandmother smiled gently and continued the explanation. Lucy's father is deployed overseas with his regiment. He's been gone for 4 months now, and we miss him terribly. But Lucy understands that he's doing important work, just like the guards here at the palace. She wanted to say thank you because she knows that protecting people is hard work, and sometimes it means being away from the people you love. Lucy nodded seriously. Daddy sends me pictures sometimes, and he looks very serious in his uniform, just like you do. Grandma explained that soldiers have to be serious when they're working, because their job is really, really important. Thompson wanted desperately to look down at this remarkable little girl, to somehow acknowledge her understanding and kindness, but his training held firm. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face showing no expression. Yet inside he felt more moved than he had been in years. The drawing lay at his feet like a small treasure. He could see every detail of it, the careful way the child had colored inside the lines, the proud smile she had given her crayon guard, the uneven letters that spelled out her message of gratitude. It was clear that Lucy had spent time on this drawing, thinking about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. We come here sometimes when we miss Daddy extra much, the grandmother explained, her voice carrying the weight of months of separation. Lucy likes to see the guards because it helps her feel connected to him somehow. She says the guards remind her that there are good people in the world who take care of others. Other tourists had started to notice the scene. Some took pictures of the little girl and her drawing, though they seemed to sense that this was different from the usual attempts to get a reaction from the guard. There was something sacred about the moment that even strangers could feel. Lucy looked up at Thompson one more time. I hope you get to go home to your family soon, she said, and I hope they know how brave you are. That was when it happened. Thompson felt something warm and wet roll down his cheek. A single tear falling despite all his training, despite all his discipline, despite everything he had been taught about maintaining composure. The tear was small, barely visible to anyone who was not looking closely. It traced a thin line down his face and disappeared into the collar of his red tunic. But it was there, real and undeniable, a crack in the perfect facade he had maintained for so many years. Lucy did not seem to notice the tear, but her grandmother did. The older woman's eyes widened slightly, and then her face softened with understanding. She placed both hands on Lucy's shoulders and gently guided her back a step. Thank you, the grandmother whispered, so quietly that only Thompson could hear. Thank you for letting us know that you're human too. They stood there for another minute, the three of them sharing a moment that none of them would ever forget. Then the grandmother took Lucy's hand and they began to walk away. Will he keep my picture? Lucy asked as they moved toward the next part of their tour. I think he will treasure it, her grandmother replied. I think it means more to him than you could possibly know. As they disappeared into the crowd, Thompson continued to stand at his post. But something fundamental had changed. The weight of his uniform felt different somehow, not lighter exactly, but more meaningful. The stiffness of his posture felt less like a burden and more like a choice he was making, for a reason that mattered. The drawing remained at his feet for the rest of his shift. Other tourists noticed it and pointed it out to their companions. Some seemed to understand that something special had happened, even if they did not know exactly what it was. When Thompson's shift ended 2 hours later and the next guard took his place, he carefully picked up Lucy's drawing. He folded it gently and placed it inside his uniform pocket, right over his heart. It would stay there for the rest of his career, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments come from the smallest gestures, and that true understanding can come from the most unexpected places. 3 days had passed since Lucy's visit, and Thompson found himself thinking about her drawing more often than he expected. During quiet moments on duty, he could feel the folded paper resting against his chest, a constant reminder of her words. The simple act of acknowledging his role as a protector had awakened something in him that he had not realized was sleeping. Friday morning brought gray clouds and a light drizzle that made the palace courtyard glisten. Thompson took his position as usual, but today felt different somehow. He was more aware of the people around him, more conscious of their individual stories rather than seeing them as just a crowd of tourists. Around 11 o'clock, he noticed an elderly man making his way slowly through the gathering crowd. The man was in a wheelchair, being pushed by a woman who appeared to be his daughter. What caught Thompson's attention immediately were the medals pinned to the old man's jacket, several rows of military decorations that spoke of long service and significant sacrifice. The man looked to be in his late 80s or early 90s. His back was straight despite his age, and there was something unmistakably military about the way he carried himself, even seated in the wheelchair. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his clothes were pressed and clean. This was someone who still took pride in his appearance, who still understood the importance of presenting himself with dignity. As they approached Thompson's post, the old man raised his hand, signaling his daughter to stop the wheelchair. He studied Thompson for a long moment, taking in every detail of the uniform, the posture, the unwavering discipline. There was recognition in his eyes, the look of one soldier acknowledging another. The daughter leaned down to speak quietly with her father. "Are you sure you want to do this, Dad? You know your arthritis has been bothering you." The old man waved her concern away with a gesture that was both gentle and firm. "Some things are more important than a little pain, love. This young man deserves proper recognition." Thompson could hear every word, though he maintained his forward gaze. He was curious about what the old veteran was planning, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. With obvious effort and determination, the elderly man began to lift himself out of his wheelchair. His daughter immediately moved to help him, supporting his arm as he slowly, carefully stood up. His legs shook slightly from the effort, and Thompson could see the pain the movement caused him. But the old man's face showed only resolve. Once standing, the veteran took a moment to steady himself. Then, with movements that were slow but precise, he brought his right hand up in a perfect military salute. Despite his age, despite the tremor in his hand, despite the obvious discomfort he was experiencing, the salute was crisp and respectful. "Thank you, son," he said in a voice that carried the weight of decades. "Thank you for carrying on the tradition." Thompson felt his heart begin to race. In all his training, in all his years of service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. Here was a man who had clearly served his country with honor, showing respect to a much younger soldier. The gesture was so pure, so genuine, that it cut through every layer of protocol and touched something deep in Thompson's soul. The old man held his salute steady, waiting. Around them, other tourists had begun to notice what was happening. Conversations quieted, cameras came up, and a circle of respectful silence formed around the two soldiers. Thompson knew the rules. He knew that breaking character could result in disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the guard. He knew that his commanding officers expected absolute adherence to protocol, regardless of circumstances. He knew that hundreds of people were watching, many of them recording the moment on their phones. But he also knew something else. He knew that some moments transcend rules and regulations. He knew that respect, properly given, deserves to be properly returned. He knew that this old veteran, who had probably faced dangers and hardships that Thompson could barely imagine, deserved recognition for what he had given to his country. The decision happened almost without conscious thought. Thompson's right hand moved slowly, deliberately until it reached the proper position. He returned the salute with the same precision and respect that the old man had shown him. For a moment, the two soldiers stood there, young and old, separated by decades but united by service. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief time, something profound passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and the understanding that true service often goes unrecognized except by those who have served themselves. The old veteran smiled, an expression of deep satisfaction crossing his weathered face. "Well done, lad," he said softly. "Well done indeed." As the old man slowly lowered his hand, Thompson did the same. The veteran's daughter helped him back into his wheelchair, and Thompson could see tears in her eyes as she watched her father settle back into his seat. "Dad served in Korea," she explained quietly, speaking to Thompson even though she knew he could not respond. "He was just 18 when he enlisted. Spent 2 years in the worst conditions you can imagine. He's always said that the hardest part was not the fighting, but coming home and having no one understand what he had been through. The old man nodded, looking up at Thompson with eyes that held both sadness and pride. This generation understands, he said. They know what service means. They know what it costs. Around them, the crowd had grown larger. People who had witnessed the exchange seemed to understand that they had seen something special. Some were taking pictures, but there was nothing intrusive or disrespectful about their attention. Instead, there was a sense of reverence, as if everyone present recognized the significance of what had just occurred. The veteran reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small pin, a military insignia that Thompson recognized as belonging to a Korean War Veterans Association, with hands that shook slightly but moved with purpose. He placed the pin on the ground near Thompson's feet, next to where Lucy's drawing had been placed days earlier. From one soldier to another, he said simply. As the wheelchair began to move away, pushed by the veteran's still emotional daughter, Thompson heard the old man speak one more time. Your parents should be proud, son. Your country is proud, and every veteran who sees you stand there knows that the tradition is in good hands. The crowd gradually dispersed, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. Thompson stood even straighter, if that was possible, feeling the weight of the veteran's words and the responsibility they implied. Unknown to Thompson, several people in the crowd had recorded the entire exchange. Within hours, the video would be uploaded to social media platforms, where it would spread rapidly across the internet. The simple, powerful image of two soldiers showing mutual respect would touch millions of people around the world. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Thompson had recognized something important, that true discipline sometimes means knowing when to bend the rules, and that the highest form of respect is often found in the simplest gestures. The veteran's salute had honored not just Thompson personally, but every guard who had stood at that post, and Thompson's response had honored every veteran who had served before him. By Saturday evening, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. What had started as a simple recording by a tourist from Canada had become an internet sensation that crossed every social media platform and news outlet imaginable. The footage was remarkably clear. The person recording had captured every detail of the exchange between Thompson and the elderly veteran. You could see the old man's struggle to stand, the precision of his salute, and most importantly, Thompson's decision to break protocol and return the gesture. The audio picked up every word the veteran had spoken, including his final comment about the tradition being in good hands. Thompson had no idea about any of this when he reported for duty on Saturday morning. The palace guards were not allowed to use their phones during shifts, and he had spent his off-duty time visiting his sister rather than browsing the internet. He took his position as usual, focused his mind on his mental exercises, and prepared for another routine day of standing watch. But this day was far from routine. The first sign that something unusual was happening came around 10 o'clock, when Thompson noticed that the crowd gathering around his post was much larger than normal. Instead of the usual mix of tourists, there seemed to be more people with professional cameras, and several individuals who looked like reporters. Some of the visitors were behaving differently too. Instead of trying to make him react or pose for silly photos, many were standing quietly, almost reverently. Several people placed flowers near his feet, and others left small notes or tokens of appreciation. A few veterans in the crowd stood at attention when they passed, showing their own signs of respect. Thompson was puzzled by the change in atmosphere, but he maintained his discipline and continued his duties as always. It was not until his lunch break that he learned what had happened. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, called him into the office immediately after his shift ended. Thompson's first thought was that he was in trouble for returning the veteran's salute. He had been expecting this conversation and had already prepared to accept whatever consequences came his way. "Thompson," Captain Reynolds began, "we need to talk about yesterday's incident." "Yes, sir," Thompson replied, standing at attention. "I understand that I broke protocol, and I'm prepared to accept responsibility for my actions." The captain studied him for a moment, then turned his computer screen so Thompson could see it. "Before we discuss discipline, I think you should see something." The screen showed the video of Thompson and the veteran, but it also showed numbers that made Thompson's eyes widen. Fuse 2847,293. Shares 156,847. Comments 23,456. The video had been shared on every major social media platform, picked up by news organizations, and was being discussed on television programs around the world. "Sir, I don't understand," Thompson said, genuinely confused. Captain Reynolds clicked on the comments section. "Read some of these," he instructed. Thompson began scrolling through the responses, and what he saw amazed him. The comments came from people all over the world, and the overwhelming majority were positive. Veterans from different countries shared their own stories of service and sacrifice. Family members of soldiers expressed their gratitude for the respect shown to their loved ones. Ordinary citizens talked about being moved by the simple display of mutual honor between two generations of servicemen. "My grandfather fought in World War II and never talked about it," read one comment. "Seeing this made me understand why these traditions matter so much," another said. "I'm not even British, but this made me proud of what these guards represent. This is what respect looks like." A particularly touching comment came from a military spouse. "My husband has been deployed for 8 months. Seeing this guard honor that veteran reminds me that my husband's service matters too, even when it feels like no one notices." There were thousands of similar messages. Veterans from Korea, Vietnam, the Falklands, Iraq, and Afghanistan all shared their appreciation for what they had witnessed. Active duty soldiers expressed their pride in seeing military traditions honored across generations. Even civilians who had never served seemed to understand the significance of the moment. Captain Reynolds let Thompson read for several minutes before speaking again. "The palace has received over 300 phone calls since yesterday evening. Every single one has been positive. People are calling to express their support for you and for the decision you made." Thompson looked up from the screen, still trying to process what he was seeing. "Sir, I want to be clear that I understand I violated protocol." "I'm not trying to use this attention to excuse what I did." "Thompson," the captain said, his tone softer than usual, "tell me why you returned that salute." Thompson thought carefully before answering. "Sir, that man had clearly served his country with honor. He was in obvious pain, but he made the effort to show respect for our traditions and for what we represent. It felt wrong not to acknowledge that sacrifice. I knew I was breaking the rules, but in that moment it felt like the right thing to do." The captain nodded slowly. "And would you make the same decision again?" "Yes, sir, I would." Captain Reynolds turned the computer screen back toward himself and was quiet for a long moment. "Thompson, the palace has been in communication with military leadership about this incident. Normally, breaking character while on duty would result in immediate disciplinary action. However, the response to your actions has been so overwhelmingly positive that we're in uncharted territory." He pulled out a folder and opened it on his desk. "We've received letters from veteran organizations, active military units, and civilian groups all expressing support for what you did. The Royal British Legion has issued a statement calling your action a perfect example of military courtesy and respect. The Korean War Veterans Association has requested permission to present you with a commendation." Thompson was stunned. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "The truth is, Thompson, your instinct was correct. While we must maintain our standards and traditions, we also serve the people of this country. Sometimes serving the people means recognizing that our humanity is part of what makes our service meaningful." The captain closed the folder and looked directly at Thompson. "You will not be disciplined for your actions. However, we are using this incident as an opportunity to review our guidelines. The palace wants to ensure that our guards understand they have permission to exercise appropriate judgment in extraordinary circumstances." Over the following days, the story continued to grow. News programs ran features about the history of the Queen's Guard and the significance of military traditions. Social media users shared their own stories of military service and sacrifice. The video was translated into dozens of languages and sparked conversations about respect, duty, and honor in countries around the world. Thompson found himself in an unusual position. He was still required to maintain his duties as a guard, but he had also become an unexpected symbol of something larger. The palace received requests for interviews, but Thompson declined them all, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. What surprised him most was how the incident had affected other guards. Several of his colleagues approached him privately to share their own stories of moments when they had been tempted to break protocol for compassionate reasons. These conversations revealed that Thompson's experience was not Unique, many guards had faced situations where their training conflicted with their human instincts. The viral nature of the video had accomplished something unexpected. It had reminded the world that behind the ceremonial uniforms and rigid discipline were real people with real emotions, making real sacrifices in service to something greater than themselves. The moment of human connection between Thompson and the veteran had shown that true strength lay not in suppressing humanity, but in knowing when to let it shine through. The attention surrounding Thompson's salute had created an unexpected atmosphere among the Queen's Guard. For the first time in years, guards found themselves discussing situations where they had faced moral dilemmas while on duty. The viral video had given them permission to acknowledge that their service sometimes involved more than just standing still and looking impressive. Guard Wilson was one of the first to share his story. It had happened 2 years earlier, during the wettest October anyone could remember. For 3 days straight, London had been pounded by torrential rain that turned streets into rivers and made even short walks outdoors miserable. Wilson had been stationed at his post outside St. James's Palace when the storm reached its worst point. The rain was coming down so hard that visibility was reduced to just a few yards, and the wind was strong enough to make standing upright a challenge even for someone trained in maintaining perfect posture. Most tourists had taken shelter indoors, leaving the area around the palace unusually quiet. Wilson stood at his post, water streaming off his tall bearskin hat and soaking through his heavy uniform. The red wool fabric had become dark and heavy with moisture, making every movement more difficult. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, through the sheets of rain, Wilson noticed a figure huddled against a building about 30 yards from his position. At first he thought it might be a tourist waiting for the storm to pass. But as the minutes ticked by and the figure remained motionless, Wilson began to worry. The person appeared to be an elderly man, dressed in clothes that were completely inadequate for the weather. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the building wall, and even from a distance Wilson could see that he was shivering violently. The man's thin jacket offered no protection against the driving rain, and his position suggested that he might be unconscious or in serious distress. Wilson faced an impossible choice. His orders were clear and non-negotiable: remain at his post regardless of circumstances. The only exceptions were direct threats to the royal family or the palace itself. A homeless person in distress did not qualify as grounds for abandoning his duties, but Wilson could see that the man was in real danger. Hypothermia could kill someone in these conditions, especially an elderly person who might already be in poor health. The temperature had dropped significantly with the storm, and the combination of cold and wet conditions created a life-threatening situation. For 20 minutes, Wilson watched and hoped that someone else would notice the man and offer help. But the street remained empty except for the occasional car that splashed through puddles without stopping. Emergency services were overwhelmed with storm-related calls, and it seemed unlikely that help would arrive in time. The moment of decision came when Wilson saw the man slump forward. The movement was subtle, but it looked like someone losing consciousness. Wilson knew that if the man was suffering from severe hypothermia, he might have only minutes before the situation became irreversible. Wilson made his choice. Despite every instinct trained into him over months of preparation, despite the certain knowledge that he would face serious consequences, he stepped away from his post and began moving toward the collapsed figure. The moment his feet left their assigned position, Wilson felt like he was entering unknown territory. For 2 years, he had never moved from his post except during official ceremonies. The simple act of walking while wearing his full uniform felt strange and almost forbidden. As he got closer to the man, Wilson could see that his assessment had been correct. The elderly homeless man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. His skin had taken on a dangerous blue-gray color that Wilson recognized as a sign of severe hypothermia. Without immediate intervention, the man would almost certainly die. Wilson did not hesitate. He immediately removed his heavy red tunic, the most substantial piece of his uniform, and wrapped it around the unconscious man. The thick wool fabric was soaked from the rain, but it was still much warmer than the thin clothes the man had been wearing. Using his radio, Wilson called for emergency medical assistance, identifying himself and providing their exact location. He then used his basic first aid training to position the man in a way that would help preserve body heat and protect his airway. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes, though it felt much longer to Wilson. The paramedics immediately took over care of the homeless man, working quickly to stabilize his condition and prepare him for transport to the hospital. One of the medics told Wilson that his quick action had probably saved the man's life. As the ambulance pulled away, Wilson realized that he was standing in the rain wearing only his white shirt and formal trousers, having given away the most visible part of his uniform to help a stranger. More importantly, he had abandoned his post for nearly 15 minutes, something that would normally result in immediate dismissal from the guard. When Captain Reynolds arrived on the scene 20 minutes later, Wilson was back at his post, standing at attention despite being soaked to the skin and missing his tunic. The captain's expression was unreadable as he surveyed the situation and listened to Wilson's report of what had happened. "Wilson," the captain said finally, "you understand that what you did was a serious breach of protocol?" "Yes, sir," Wilson replied. "I understand completely and I accept full responsibility for my actions." "And would you do the same thing again, knowing the consequences?" Wilson did not hesitate. "Yes, sir. That man would have died if no one helped him. I could not stand there and watch that happen." Captain Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, studying Wilson's face. "The homeless man you helped is named Henry Peterson. He's 73 years old and a veteran of the Falklands War. The doctors at the hospital said that without your intervention, he would not have survived another hour in those conditions." Wilson felt a mix of relief and pride, but also continued worry about his future with the guard. The captain continued, "Wilson, your actions put you in violation of standing orders. However, they also demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character we want in our guards. Sometimes the most important part of serving your country is remembering who you are serving it for." Rather than facing dismissal, Wilson received a formal commendation for his actions. The incident was also used as a case study in training new guards, helping them understand that while discipline and protocol were essential, they should never override basic human compassion. When lives were at stake, Henry Peterson recovered fully from his hypothermia and was eventually connected with veteran services that helped him find permanent housing. He sent a letter to Wilson through the palace, expressing his gratitude and sharing that the guard's willingness to help a stranger had restored his faith in humanity during a very dark period of his life. Wilson's story, when he shared it in the wake of Thompson's viral moment, helped other guards realize that their service had meaning beyond just maintaining traditions. They were protectors in the truest sense, and sometimes protection meant making difficult choices that went beyond their official duties. The story also reinforced the lesson that Thompson's salute had begun to teach, that the most powerful moments of service often came when guards allowed their humanity to show through their discipline rather than despite it. Among all the guards who found their voices in the weeks following Thompson's viral moment, Guard Roberts had the most powerful story to share. It was also the most difficult for her to tell, involving emotions and choices that had challenged everything she thought she understood about duty and compassion. Roberts was one of only a handful of women serving in the Queen's Guard, having earned her position through the same rigorous training that every guard completed, regardless of gender. She had faced additional challenges and scrutiny, knowing that her performance would be seen as representing all women who might follow in her footsteps. This pressure had made her even more determined to maintain perfect discipline and adherence to protocol. The incident that changed her perspective had occurred during a major state ceremony 6 months earlier. The occasion was the annual memorial service for fallen soldiers, held on the grounds of Buckingham Palace. Thousands of people had gathered to honor those who had given their lives in service to their country, including family members of soldiers who had died in recent conflicts. Roberts had been assigned to one of the most visible positions during the ceremony, standing at attention near the main entrance where the royal family would pass. The crowd was larger and more emotional than usual, with many people carrying photographs of deceased loved ones and wearing memorial ribbons and pins. About halfway through the ceremony, Roberts noticed a disturbance in the crowd to her left. A woman appeared to be in severe distress, crying uncontrollably and clutching what looked like a military photograph to her chest. She was not causing any disruption or threat to security, but her grief was so raw and visible that it was drawing concerned looks from other attendees. The woman looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair and clothes that suggested she had made a special effort to dress formally for the occasion. She held the photograph like it was the most precious thing in the world, and even from a distance, Roberts could see that it showed a young soldier in military dress uniform. As the ceremony continued, the woman's distress seemed to intensify rather than subside. She was trying to be quiet and respectful, but her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs and tears streamed continuously down her face. Several people near her offered tissues or gentle words of comfort, but nothing seemed to help. Roberts found herself increasingly focused on the grieving woman, even as she maintained her formal position and attention to the ceremony. Something about the woman's pain resonated deeply with her, perhaps because Roberts understood the military world and the sacrifices it demanded from families as well as soldiers. During a quiet moment in the ceremony, Roberts heard the woman speak to someone standing next to her. Her voice was barely audible, but the words carried clearly in the still air. "I just got the news yesterday. He was only 22. I came here because I didn't know where else to go." The woman was explaining that her son had been killed in action in Afghanistan just 24 hours earlier. She had received the devastating news from military officials, and in her shock and grief she had decided to attend the memorial service. She said she hoped that being around other people who understood military sacrifice might help her process what had happened. Roberts felt her heart break for this mother, who was experiencing the worst nightmare any military parent could imagine. The woman had lost her child and was now standing among strangers, holding his photograph and trying to find some way to honor his memory and cope with her overwhelming grief. As the ceremony progressed toward its conclusion, Roberts made a decision that went against every rule she had been taught. She began to subtly shift her attention toward the grieving mother, using her peripheral vision to monitor the woman's condition while still maintaining her formal stance. When the woman looked in her direction, Roberts did something that could have ended her career. She made brief, gentle eye contact and offered the smallest possible nod of acknowledgement. It was a gesture so subtle that most people would not have noticed it, but to the grieving mother, it was clearly visible and unmistakably intentional. The woman's eyes widened slightly when she realized that the guard had seen her and was offering a sign of recognition. She pressed the photograph closer to her chest and mouthed the words "thank you" in Robert's direction. That tiny exchange seemed to provide the woman with some measure of comfort. She stood a little straighter, and her tears, while still flowing, seemed less desperate and more peaceful. The simple acknowledgement from someone in uniform had somehow validated her presence and her grief. But Roberts was not finished. When the ceremony officially ended and the crowd began to disperse, she faced the most difficult decision of her military career. She could return to her duties and let the moment pass, or she could risk everything to offer more substantial comfort to a mother who was facing the darkest day of her life. Roberts chose compassion over protocol. As soon as she was officially relieved from her ceremonial duties, she approached the woman who was standing alone near the memorial wall, still holding her son's photograph. "Ma'am," Roberts said quietly, removing her tall bearskin hat as a sign of respect, "I wanted to express my condolences for your loss." The woman looked up at Roberts with surprise and gratitude. "You noticed me during the ceremony," she said. "You gave me a little nod. That meant more to me than you could possibly know." "What was your son's name?" Roberts asked. "David," the woman replied, showing Roberts the photograph. "David Michael Chen. He was a medic. He died trying to help wounded soldiers during an attack on their base." Roberts studied the young man's face in the photograph. He looked even younger than 22, with a serious expression but kind eyes. She could see his mother's features reflected in his face, and she could imagine the pride this woman had felt when he chose to serve his country. "David sounds like he was a remarkable young man," Roberts said, "and it's clear that he learned his compassion and dedication from an incredible mother." That was when the woman broke down completely. All the grief and shock she had been holding inside came pouring out, and she began to sob with an intensity that came from the very depths of her soul. Without thinking about regulations, career consequences, or anything else except human compassion, Roberts opened her arms and embraced the grieving mother. For several minutes they stood together near the memorial wall, a uniformed guard and a devastated parent sharing a moment of profound human connection. "He was so proud to serve," the woman whispered through her tears. "He always said that helping people was the most important thing anyone could do. I just wish I could tell him one more time how proud I was of him." "He knows," Roberts said softly. and he would be proud of you too, for coming here today to honor him and all the others who have served." When they finally separated, the woman wiped her eyes and looked at Roberts with an expression of deep gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "Thank you for treating my son's memory with respect. Today was the hardest day of my life, but you made it bearable." Roberts walked the woman to the palace gates where her sister was waiting to drive her home. As the car pulled away, Roberts realized that she had just experienced the most meaningful moment of her entire military career. When she reported the incident to her commanding officer, Roberts expected to face serious disciplinary action. Instead, she found that her superiors understood and supported her decision. The royal family, when they learned of the incident, sent a personal note expressing their appreciation for the compassion she had shown to a grieving military family. Robert's story became a powerful reminder that service to country includes service to the people who sacrifice for that country. Her willingness to break protocol to comfort a grieving mother demonstrated that true strength sometimes requires the courage to show vulnerability and compassion, even when it means risking everything you have worked for. The stories emerging from the Queen's Guard had reached the highest levels of the British government and royal household within 2 weeks of Thompson's viral salute. What had started as isolated incidents of guards showing human compassion was now being discussed in meetings at Buckingham Palace, the Ministry of Defense, and even number 10 Downing Street. Palace officials found themselves in an unprecedented situation. For over 3 centuries, the Queen's Guard had operated under strict protocols that prioritized tradition and discipline above all else. Guards were expected to be living statues, symbols of unwavering duty who never acknowledged the world around them. These rules had been tested countless times but had never been seriously questioned until now. The public response to the Guard's acts of compassion had been overwhelmingly positive, but it had also created a dilemma for palace administrators. How could they maintain the dignity and tradition of the institution while acknowledging that times were changing and that the public clearly valued the humanity of the Guards as much as their discipline? Lord Chamberlain Hartwell, the senior official responsible for the royal household, had been receiving reports about the Guards' behavior for weeks. Unlike previous generations of palace officials, who might have simply enforced stricter discipline, Hartwell understood that the world had changed. Social media, global connectivity, and changing attitudes toward authority meant that institutions had to evolve to remain relevant. The turning point came during a private meeting between Hartwell and several senior military officials, including General Morrison, who oversaw the ceremonial duties of the household regiments. The meeting had been called to discuss whether disciplinary action should be taken against the Guards who had broken protocol. "The question we face," General Morrison explained to the assembled group, "is whether we prioritize absolute adherence to rules or whether we recognize that these men and women are serving a greater purpose that sometimes transcends specific protocols." Hartwell had reviewed all the incidents carefully. Thompson's salute to the veteran, Wilson's assistance to the homeless man, Robert's embrace of the grieving mother. Each case involved a guard making a split-second decision to choose human compassion over rigid protocol. In every case, the public response had been supportive, even admiring. "What concerns me," said Colonel Phillips, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard, "is the precedent we set. If we explicitly allow guards to break protocol when they feel it's justified, how do we maintain any discipline at all?" Hartwell understood the colonel's concern, but he also recognized that the world was watching how the palace handled this situation. The royal family's popularity had always depended partly on their ability to balance tradition with relevance to contemporary life. The Guard's actions had shown that it was possible to honor the past while remaining connected to present-day human values. The discussion continued for hours, with officials debating the implications of different approaches. Some argued for maintaining the status quo, insisting that any deviation from protocol weakened the entire institution. Others suggested that the Guard's actions represented the best of British values and should be celebrated rather than discouraged. The breakthrough came when Hartwell received a personal message from a member of the royal family, expressing strong support for the Guard's actions and suggesting that their compassion reflected the values that the monarchy itself was meant to represent. This royal endorsement gave Hartwell the authority he needed to propose a new approach. Rather than punishing the Guards or dramatically changing the rules, The palace decided to issue a carefully worded statement that acknowledged the recent events while maintaining respect for tradition. The statement took weeks to craft, with every word reviewed by legal experts, military officials, and communications specialists. The statement was released on a Wednesday morning, timed to coincide with the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Media outlets had been given advance notice that the palace would be making an important announcement regarding the Queen's Guard, ensuring maximum coverage of the message. The Queen's Guard represents centuries of British military tradition and continues to serve with distinction in protecting our royal palaces and upholding the dignity of the crown, the statement began. Recent events have highlighted the exceptional character and judgment of the men and women who wear the uniform of the household regiments. The statement went on to acknowledge the specific incidents that had captured public attention, describing them as examples of the values that the royal family and the nation held dear. Rather than treating these actions as violations of protocol, the palace characterized them as demonstrations of the Guard's understanding of their deeper purpose. While ceremonial discipline remains fundamental to the role of the Queen's Guard, these soldiers are first and foremost servants of the British people, the statement continued. Their training has always emphasized good judgment, and recent events have shown that this judgment extends to recognizing when human compassion serves the greater good. The most significant part of the statement came in its final paragraphs, where the palace announced subtle but important changes to the Guard's operational guidelines. While maintaining that ceremonial duties required strict adherence to protocol, the new guidelines explicitly recognized that Guards were authorized to use their judgment in extraordinary circumstances involving genuine human need. The changes were carefully limited to prevent abuse while allowing for the kind of compassionate actions that had already occurred. Guards could still not speak to tourists or break character for entertainment purposes, but they now had official permission to respond appropriately to medical emergencies, situations involving veterans or military families, and other circumstances where their assistance could prevent harm or honor service. The palace also announced the establishment of a new recognition program for Guards who demonstrated exceptional judgment in balancing duty with compassion. Rather than facing disciplinary action, Guards like Thompson, Wilson, and Roberts would receive commendations for their service. The public response to the palace statement was immediately positive. Veterans organizations praised the recognition of military values beyond simple obedience. Mental health advocates appreciated the acknowledgement that human compassion was compatible with professional duty. Even traditionalists found comfort in the statement's emphasis on maintaining ceremonial standards while allowing for appropriate flexibility. International media coverage was extensive, with news outlets around the world reporting on what they called a modernization of ancient traditions. The story was seen as an example of how institutions could evolve without losing their essential character, and several other countries with ceremonial guard units began reviewing their own protocols. For the Guards themselves, the palace statement provided validation and relief. They no longer had to choose between their training and their conscience, knowing that their superiors understood and supported appropriate exercises of judgment and compassion. The announcement also had an unexpected effect on recruitment for the household regiments. Young people who might have been deterred by the image of robotic discipline were now attracted to an institution that valued both tradition and humanity. Applications increased by 30% in the months following the palace statement. More importantly, the new guidelines helped Guards understand that their role was more nuanced and meaningful than they had previously realized. They were not just ceremonial figures or tourist attractions. They were representatives of the best values of their nation, entrusted with the judgment to uphold those values even when it meant departing from strict protocol. The palace statement marked a historic moment in the evolution of one of Britain's most visible traditions. By acknowledging that true strength lay in knowing when to bend without breaking, the royal household had demonstrated that even centuries-old institutions could adapt to changing times while preserving their essential dignity and purpose. 6 months had passed since the palace statement that changed everything for the Queen's Guard. The autumn air was crisp and clear as Thompson took his position at the familiar post where his journey toward a new understanding had begun. The leaves on the trees around Buckingham Palace were turning golden and red, creating a beautiful backdrop for the daily ceremony that continued to draw visitors from around the world. But everything was different now, even though everything looked exactly the same. Thompson still wore the same red tunic, still carried himself with the same military precision, still maintained the same disciplined silence that had defined the Queen's Guard for centuries. To casual observers, nothing had changed at all. Yet Thompson could feel the difference in every breath he took. The weight of his uniform felt different, not lighter exactly, but more meaningful. The stiffness of his posture felt less like a burden and more like a choice he was making with full understanding of its purpose. Most importantly, the silence he maintained was no longer empty. It was filled with awareness and connection to the people around him. The tourists still came in droves, still took their photos, still marveled at the pageantry and tradition. But Thompson noticed that many of them seemed to approach the guards with greater respect than before. The viral videos and news stories had educated the public about the real people behind the ceremonial masks, and this understanding had changed how visitors behaved. Children in particular seemed different. Instead of trying to make the guards laugh or break character, many young visitors would stand quietly and watch with obvious admiration. Some would salute, copying what they had seen in the famous video of Thompson and the veteran. Others would simply say thank you in quiet voices, as if they understood that the guards were doing something important. Thompson had become something of a celebrity among his fellow guards, though he remained humble about his role in sparking the changes. The original drawing from Little Lucy still rested in his uniform pocket, carried with him every day as a reminder of how small gestures could have enormous impact. On this particular morning, Thompson noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. It was Lucy, now noticeably taller and older, walking hand in hand with her grandmother. She was carrying something in her free hand, another piece of paper that looked suspiciously like another drawing. As they got closer, Thompson could see that Lucy had grown more confident in the months since their first encounter. She walked with purpose, clearly on a mission. Her grandmother smiled warmly as they approached Thompson's post, understanding the significance of this return visit. Lucy stopped in the same spot where she had placed her first drawing 6 months earlier. She looked up at Thompson with eyes that sparkled with recognition and something that might have been pride. Then very carefully she placed her new artwork on the ground near his feet. This drawing was more sophisticated than the first one, showing that Lucy's artistic skills had improved with age and practice. It depicted a guard in full uniform, standing tall and proud, but this time the figure was surrounded by other people, a veteran saluting, a woman being comforted, children watching respectfully, and families standing nearby with expressions of gratitude. At the bottom of the drawing, in handwriting that was much neater than before, Lucy had written, "Thank you for showing everyone that being strong means being kind too." Thompson felt the familiar warmth in his chest that he had experienced during their first meeting. But this time it was accompanied by a deeper sense of satisfaction. Lucy's drawing captured something important about what had happened over the past months. The understanding that true strength included the courage to show compassion when it was needed. Her grandmother leaned down and whispered something in Lucy's ear. The little girl nodded and stepped closer to Thompson's post. "My daddy came home last month," she said in a clear, happy voice. "He said he heard about what you did and he's proud of you. He said soldiers are supposed to take care of people, and you showed everyone how to do that the right way." Thompson maintained his forward gaze and stoic expression, but inside he felt a tremendous sense of joy and vindication. Lucy's father, serving somewhere far from home, had heard the story and understood its significance. This connection between soldiers across different branches of service and different kinds of duty was exactly what Thompson had hoped, for when he made his decision to return the veteran's salute as Lucy and her grandmother prepared to continue their visit, the little girl did something unexpected. Instead of simply walking away, she stood at attention in front of Thompson's post and offered her own small salute. It was not perfect. Her hand was positioned slightly wrong, and her posture was more enthusiastic than precise. But the gesture was filled with genuine respect and understanding. For just a moment, Thompson allowed the corners of his mouth to turn upward in the faintest suggestion of a smile. It was so subtle that most people would not have noticed it, but Lucy saw it immediately. Her face lit up with delight and she lowered her hand with obvious satisfaction. The grandmother placed her hands on Lucy's shoulders, and they began to walk toward the next part of their tour. As they moved away, Thompson heard the older woman explaining to Lucy that the guard's tiny smile was special, a sign that he had heard her message and appreciated her understanding. Throughout the rest of his shift, Thompson reflected on how much had changed since that first encounter with Lucy. The palace guidelines had given him and his fellow guards permission to use their judgment in extraordinary circumstances, but more importantly, they had given the guards permission to see themselves as complete human beings rather than just ceremonial figures. This new understanding had spread throughout the ranks of the Queen's Guard. Younger guards now received training that emphasized both traditional discipline and appropriate compassion. They learned about the history of their role, but they also learned about their responsibility to the people they served. They practiced maintaining ceremonial composure, but they also discussed scenarios where human judgment might require flexibility. The changes had attracted positive attention from around the world. Other countries with ceremonial guard units had begun examining their own protocols, looking for ways to balance tradition with humanity. Military academies had incorporated the Queen's Guard story into their leadership training, using it as an example of how true discipline sometimes required the courage to do what was right, rather than just what was expected. Veterans organizations had embraced the new approach, finding in it a validation of their own experiences and sacrifices. The mutual respect between the elderly veteran and Thompson had resonated with military families everywhere, reminding them that their service was recognized and honored by future generations of soldiers. Mental health advocates had also praised the changes, noting that the Guard's willingness to show compassion could help reduce the stigma associated with emotional expression in military settings. The image of strong, disciplined soldiers who could also show kindness and empathy provided a healthier model of military service than the traditional emphasis on emotional suppression. For Thompson personally, the experience had transformed his understanding of what it meant to serve. He no longer saw his role as simply standing still and looking impressive. Instead, he understood himself as a guardian of values as well as places, someone entrusted with representing the best of his nation's character, as well as its traditions. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the palace courtyard, Thompson prepared for the end of his shift. Soon another guard would take his place, continuing the unbroken chain of service that stretched back through centuries of British history. But now that chain was stronger, not weaker, because it acknowledged the full humanity of the people who forged each link. The Queen's Guard would continue to stand watch with the same dedication and discipline they had always shown, but they would do so with the knowledge that their greatest moments of service might well be those when they chose compassion over protocol, understanding over inflexibility, and human connection over rigid tradition. Thompson's story had begun with a simple salute returned to an elderly veteran, but it had evolved into something much larger, a reminder that the strongest institutions are those that can grow and adapt while maintaining their essential character, and that true service sometimes requires the courage to break the rules in order to honor the deeper principles those rules were meant to protect.